Well, there's a big event in Washington today. It's a gathering to mark World Refugee Day, which actually falls on Saturday. It's the 9th year the UN Relief Agency has marked the event to draw attention to the millions of people around the world forced to flee their homes every year. Hollywood actress Angelina Jolie is speaking now. Let's listen in.
Stripped of home and country, refugees are buffeted from every ill wind that blows across this planet. I remember meeting a pregnant Afghani woman in a completely abandoned camp in Pakistan. She couldn't travel when everyone else was relocated because she was too late in her pregnancy. She was alone with her two children and an older woman. There was nothing for miles around the camp, not a single tree, no other people in sight. So when they asked me to come in for tea, I said I didn't feel it was necessary. But being Afghans, they take pride in how they treat their guests, so they insisted. And they guided me into a small dirt house with no roof to keep out the scorching heat. And they dusted off these 2 old mats that they ate and slept and prayed on. And we sat and we talked, and they were just the loveliest women. And then with a few twigs and a single tin cup of water, they made the last of their tea, and they insisted that we enjoy it. Since before the parable of the widow's mite, it has been known that those who have the least will give the most. Most refugee families will offer you the only food they have and pretend they're not hungry. And the generosity of the poor applies not only to refugees. We should never forget that more than 80% of all refugees are hosted and have been for years and years in the poorest developing countries. Pakistan, a country now facing a crisis with over 2 million of its own people displaced, is still hosting 1.7 million Afghans and has hosted millions of Afghan families for nearly 30 years. I remember before we said goodbye to the pregnant lady, she pointed to her young boy. He had a dusty face and the brightest green eyes you've ever seen, but such a sad look, and she explained that he's always asking for more food. And it hurts her to say that they have nothing. And she asked if we would consider taking him. Would we take her son so he could eat? And she said it with tears in her eyes, such was her desperation. A desperation unimaginable to every parent in this room. A few weeks later, the war in Afghanistan began, and heavy fighting started right where they were. I've been back to that region 3 times, and I look for them every time. The threat of climate change, the competition for resources, and ever-growing global inequality have created deepening, intractable conflicts. Whether it be Darfur, Myanmar, or the Swat Valley, or some as-yet unknown crisis, mass migrations will be a feature of our future, and we must adjust to this looming reality. And again, I would urge you to look beyond the simple numbers and look instead at the individual. I remember in Tanzania, I met a child in a tent. He sat on the dusty floor. He'd been shot in the back and left paralyzed. And he crawled forward to shake my hand. He was no more than 15. He had big, pretty eyes and a big, wide, sparkling smile. And after all he'd been through, was full of laughter and love. Later that night, I asked why he'd not been taken to a hospital or at least given a wheelchair. And I was told that the boy's entire family had been killed, so there was no one to look after him. And he'd not been accepted for asylum in a third country. And the aid workers had spent the money they could, but they didn't have any more. And I thought about him all night, and I wondered what I should do. And then I remember the next day I walked through the camp, and I saw more victims of war. I saw small children full of hunger and fear, crying mothers, wounded fathers. I saw a sea of humanity. All desperate, all deserving. There were hundreds of thousands in that camp, and there are millions around the world. And at that time, I felt hopeless and overwhelmed by the realization of the magnitude of the problem. But then later on that trip, I met an 8-year-old girl who had seen her family killed in front of her. And she grabbed her baby brother, and she ran into the jungle and survived, terrified and alone, for 2 weeks. She managed to find bananas and feed herself and her brother. And when I met her, she didn't talk. she just rocked back and forth, and I kept trying to tell her how brave we thought she was, and she just stared out the window. And a year later, I came back to that same camp, and I saw her again. She was still very shy, but she was beginning to speak, and she was sweet and polite, but she still didn't care about chatting with me or visitors. She just wanted to know how her brother was. He was with the doctors, and she was just checking to make sure everything was going to be okay. She was his mother now. That little girl had a depth and a strength that I will never know. And on that trip, and many that followed, I came to know refugees.
You're just listening to remarks by Hollywood actress and UN Goodwill Ambassador Angelina Jolie. She's speaking ahead of World Refugee Day, which is this Saturday, June 20th. Here she talks about her extensive travels to countries in need and her experiences with people who are living in war-torn areas, in war-torn countries. She's at a public ceremony at the National Geographic Museum in Washington. She, along with other supporters and celebrities, are speaking today. Again, it's ahead of World Refugee Day, which takes place on Saturday, June 20th.